One. Welcome to the Alliance with your host, Andrew Hayes, episode 1. My guest today is Bob Murphy, uh, world renowned economist, arch enemy of Paul Krugman. Uh, I can't tell you how big of an honor it is to have you on my show. Um, and I don't know. You can introduce yourself better than I can.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Andrew, and for the kind words. Yeah, I'm an economist. Got my degree at NYU. I'm part of what's called the Austrian School of Economics. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Murray Rothbard, some of the big names there. They're very free market oriented, and that's why they're typically opposed to the Keynesians like Paul Krugman. But even distinguished from like the Chicago School of guys like Milton Friedman, the Austrians think that market forces should be, used even in money and banking, and that government intervention in those sectors leads to, for example, the business cycle, right? So the Austrians think that the Federal Reserve is what in the modern times fuels the business cycle, for the United States. I've taught at Hillsdale College, at Texas Tech University, and right now I'm sort of in the private sector. I'm a senior fellow with the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and working on it. I'm also at Infinio doing a lot on we're taking life insurance and putting it on the blockchain to give the elevator pitch.
Wow, that's I didn't know that last part. But what else? Oh, yeah, your podcast. You have 2 podcasts. I just found out about the the Bob Murphy show. I've been following for years. And then what's the other one? So
Okay, sure. I actually, now that it's up to 3, that I'm the hardest working man in podcasting. So
okay.
yeah, for a long time I've had the Bob Murphy Show, which, as the name suggests, is this kind of my podcast that I speak on all sorts of things that interest me. I'm the host of the Human Action podcast that the Mises Institute puts out. So they have several podcasts at this point,
Yeah.
but that's the one that's sort of narrowly focused on economic issues. Human Action being the name of Mises' magnum opus on economics, it's called Human Action, a treatise on economics. So that's, what that's focused on. And then, yes, for the company Infinio that I work for, we also have what's called the InFi. It's sort of a play on words for like DeFi. And so there, it's mostly like financial sector stuff, people who are interested in Bitcoin, stuff like that, and life insurance. That's what that podcast caters to. So yeah, I have those 3 that I host.
And we're recording on the 19th. You're 48 now, but by the time this airs, you're going to be 49. So happy birthday!
Yeah, do you know that from my Wikipedia?
From ChatGPT.
Oh, okay. What just quick funny story on that. So when I was at Texas Tech, we had to fly somewhere for a conference or economics conference, and I don't like giving personal stuff like over email or whatever. And so the executive assistant for the department was asking all of us, "Hey, I need your dates of birth, to book the flights." And so I said, "Hey, can I just, I'll just walk over and tell you. I don't want to email that." And she said, "No, I just looked it up on your Wikipedia article." I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, there you go." So
nice. So you talked a little bit about the Mises Institute. You're a senior fellow. You've been a senior fellow at the Mises Institute for like years.
Several years. I mean, I've been associated with them. I've been going there since I think either 1999 or 2000. When I was a grad student at NYU, I learned about the Institute, and then they had this great fellowship program that people getting their PhDs can, spend the summer there. If it's catering to Austrian economics, their dissertation. So I've been going there. It didn't go for obviously 2020 because of COVID and stuff. But yeah, I think I've been there every other year since. And yeah, at some point, when I got my degree, I became a fellow, and then at some point, I forget the exact when, but yeah, for several years at this point, I've been a senior fellow.
But so Ludwig von Mises, he wrote Socialism in 1922, right?
Yeah, yes, that's when the book came out. Yeah, he had it early. I think it was 1920 was his famous article on socialism, and then he expanded it into a book, I believe, in 22.
And so the common idea, like if you just turn on Right Talk conservative radio, the idea is that socialism doesn't work because nobody wants to be the trash guy, and it takes too long to go to med school, and things like that. The Mises had a completely different approach.
Right, right. So just to set the stage for people, remember that like in the uh, like late 1800s, the socialist writers were getting more and more prominent, and Karl Marx was not the first person to advocate socialism or anything, and the conservatives of the day in the classical, we'd call them now classical liberals, call like the problem of incentives, and say,
Mhm.
hey, if under socialism the amount you get paid, like the amount of the goods, like all the workers just go and do whatever the government tells them to do, or the comrades or whatever, and then there's a pile of stuff that gets produced, and then the principle of who gets what is based on like how many kids you have or things like that, not in terms of, oh well, the person who produced more gets paid more. Then the concern was, isn't that going to lead to shirking? And like you're saying, Andrew, famously, like why wouldn't everyone just want to be a librarian? Who's going to want to be the trash collector if it's to each according to his needs, not to each according to how much he produced? And so that was the incentive. But what the socialist writers in the 1800s said was, oh, you guys are right that people who grow up in this dog eat dog world of grasping capitalism, where you got to just look out for numero uno, that's the way people think. But if you were born into a socialist society where your basic needs are met, then people wouldn't think like that. Like you wouldn't mind producing more for the benefit of your fellow man, because you wouldn't be worried about that somehow hurting you or your family, because your needs would be taken care of, right? So they were talking about this new socialist man that would emerge. And so in that and when without the experience that the 20th century would bring of socialism in practice, who could say? And so you're right. So then Mises comes along and he gives a qualitatively more powerful critique, and he just stipulated for the sake of argument, suppose that everybody is willing to do whatever plans the central planners give them. The comrades are all willing to go to the factories or Siberia or wherever and work and do whatever they tell them, and assume away the problem of corruption, right? Because another big problem that the old school liberals and conservatives would bring up would be, if you give this one group of people the power to tell everyone else what to do, that's way too much. Humans can't be trusted with that much power. Okay, and Mises said, which is a perfectly valid critique, but Mises said, even put that aside. Assume that the
Mhm.
people running it are saints, and that the people, the comrades in the system, just do whatever they're told. Still, he said the fundamental problem with socialism, if the government owns all the means of production, then you don't have market prices, right? If the government owns all the factories and the farmland and all the heavy equipment and things like that, then you don't know how much is a ton of steel compared to an acre of farmland in this location, because you don't have market prices. And so even after the fact, everybody does the 5-year plan and they produce a bunch of output. Mises was saying they have no way, even ex post, of assessing, was this a good use of our scarce resources? All they would know is we expended this many labor hours, this much kerosene, this much coal, blah 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 blah, and we got this many diapers, this many new houses, this many grocery store. How would you know whether that was a wasteful or an efficient use of resources? You couldn't. So that was Mises' problem that he leveled against the socialist planners, and and then he explained, under capitalism or private property, a market economy, that problem gets solved because you do have private ownership. And so you have market prices. So each business enterprise can calculate after the fact and say, these were our costs, here's where our revenues, did we turn a profit? So Mises showed the bottom line isn't some arbitrary social convention. It actually is a way in a decentralized system to give feedback so people can know the resources that we're taking away from the rest of society, are we doing something worthwhile with them?
Yeah. So so the big thing, like you said, and I don't feel like this can be overemphasized, is that he wrote this in 1922, and um, the way I've heard it is that at that time in Europe, especially even in America, uh, socialism was supposed to be the new thing. Uh, Even the Oklahoma State flag, it's not what it is now. I don't know if you know about this. It used to be red and with one blue star and a 46. It looked very Soviet esque, if you will. We changed it uh, about the time World War II came around, I think. But um, socialism was the
Mhm.
wave of the future.
Oh, so no, I didn't know that about the Oklahoma state flag. But right, that was like I said, it's hard for us now. We're on the vantage point of growing up and knowing of the totalitarian, horrors of the 20th century and how many millions upon millions of people were killed in the people's republics that were tried around the world. But yeah, back then, people didn't know that, and Friedrich Hayek has this passage. I'm not going to get the exact wording correct, but Hayek, who was one of Mises, he wasn't a student in the sense that he literally went to school and like Hayek was an established figure, but then went to Mises' seminar and was greatly influenced by him. But Hayek wrote later on that he was a socialist. He said even something like, "In my day, all of the good men were socialists," meaning like the people who want you want to help people and there's social progress, and you can see, oh, we used to have slavery and then capitalism came and replaced that, but then now the next wave to get rid of wage slavery is socialism, and just the very name of it, right? Capitalism suggests, oh, it's an economic system that caters to the owners of capital, where socialism, oh, well, that's for society, it's for everybody, right? So how could you be against that? And why wouldn't you, instead of allowing business decisions to be made on the basis of narrow profit and loss calculations, which seems kind of arbitrary, why not take a more society-wide perspective and take into account all the different competing interests and so forth? So that was the vision. And yeah, as you said, Andrew, Hayek and others thought that was, and then Hayek read the book you're talking about. He said, I read that Mises book, Socialism, and it kind of shocked him and knocked him on his heels, and it took him a bit to recover from it intellectually. But he said that, yeah, that book made Mises a lot of friends and enemies, that a lot of
Yeah,
people, like, in other words, wouldn't it be great if socialism could work? Because like what I mean, like, oh, all we have to do is like maybe redistribute from some of the rich fat cats and we can cure poverty and everything. Would that be? But Mises sort of threw cold water on that and said, no, this isn't going to work. And Hayek
right.
was explaining, in his recollection or memoirs or whatever, that was that was a bit jarring for some, but in Hayek's mind, Mises freed me from my delusions.
See, and so he writes that in 1922, and he's putting this together. He's doing it with theory, uh, and this is a word that takes some flack, uh, kind of in my neck of the woods here in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Theory sounds like a bunch of nonsense, like the theory of evolution, the theory of global warming,
Mm-hmm.
right? But but that's not, it's not the same thing. What Mises is talking about is uh, like obvious principles, and then from that, uh, logical conclusions.
I mean, yes, I agree with everything you just said, and I do appreciate, you're right, that especially coming from economists who are infamous for, oh, well, why don't we just assume such and such, and that'll fix things, and solving, like changing the assumptions to solve some problem that isn't really what faces us in the real world. However, I would explain it more like this, though, about what Mises did. So it was the socialists, of course, who were the ones propounding this new theory that, oh, hey, why don't we just upend society and the way things, people have been doing things, and we'll have this new system, and trust us, it'll be so much better. And yeah, we may have to, in practice, kill a bunch of people in order to get our way, but trust us, once the blood stops flowing, everybody who's still alive will be that much better off, right? And so there were, like I say, various objections leveled against that, and it was the socialists who kept retreating to pure theory and just saying, no, 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 trust us, there'll be a new socialist man. And so the virtue of what Mises did is he kind of battled them on their own terms. And he
I
said,
see.
okay, fine. Yeah, let's put aside the incentive problem, which is in the real world is a big problem. Anybody who's been in an organization and seen what happens if some of the people work really hard and some of the other ones, kind of sit back and say, oh, wait a minute, I don't actually need to worry. Like that just, that's not a good mix. And Mises also said, let's put aside the problem of corruption or of evil or whatever you want to call it in terms of just power corrupting. I mean, that's something, in the real world that people with experience and wisdom know, yeah, you cannot trust people with too much power or they will abuse it. So Mises wasn't saying those are frivolous things. Like he was a very, hard-nosed student of history himself and
Yeah.
knew those were legitimate. But his point was, I'll concede for the sake of argument all that stuff, and I'm going to take you on your own terms and show still the socialist central planners, they'll be, he said, like they'll be groping in the dark. He's saying even ex post, you won't have any idea, any metric by which to evaluate your plans to know, are you making good use of society's resources? And so that was it. At first, the socialists dismissed him, and then it was over time more of the smarter ones. And I don't mean that like cheekily. I mean actually like the guys that were top level economists at major universities and stuff. They realized, oh, this Professor Mises is right. We do need to have some sort of internal accounting, and they came up with what they called market socialism, right? So they said, oh
Yeah.
yeah, the central planners could announce sort of like accounting prices. They wouldn't be market, and then so that the guy running the nail factory in the socialist society would quote be selling his output to the guy running the construction company or something, even though they don't have private property, right? So they step by step had to come back towards something that looked more and more like capitalism
Hmm.
because of Mises' critique. So again, it's more that Mises was trying to show, even in pure theory land, I can show your system's not going to work.
Well, but economics is a theoretical science,
Yeah, that's true.
right? So I got into a little bit on Facebook, of course, and I'm making the free market argument and talking about tariffs. I I think I agree with you entirely on tariffs,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's way in the weeds. But look, uh, the guy comes at me with, well, what's your experience? How do you know this? And it's like, no, it's not based on experience. It's based on economic theory. It has to be uh, a prioristic theory because, all right, so like talk about how you and Paul Krugman, y'all both look at the the downturn in '08 and the bailouts, right? And and you say, well, uh, thank goodness the bailouts weren't bigger; it would have been even worse. And Krugman is saying, thank goodness the bailouts weren't any less, or it would have been worse, right? Y'all are
Mm-hmm.
looking at the same objective data on the paper, but the theory is different.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, just to unpack that a little bit. So you're right. I'll start with the Krugman example, and then I'll circle back to the broader principles here. So right, there is it's almost a cliche for certain people to say things like, oh yeah, I'm not ideological. I don't have preconceived theories. I just look at wherever the data lead me, and that's how I make my conclusions. But if that were true, then economists wouldn't still be arguing about the Great Depression, and yet we are. And it's not simply that, oh yeah, one group of the economists is honest, the other ones are a bunch of liars, right? Like it's no, like you're saying, Andrew, you can look at the same data, and the part of the issue is like if chemists disagree about, hey, what's the boiling point of water, they can keep running hundreds of experiments and be pretty sure that, well, no, this guy says he thinks it's 90 degrees Celsius, and no, we've done that 1,000 times at 90 Celsius and it's not boiling, so we don't think it is. That's not right? So you can do that. Whereas with the Great Depression, if you want to say, oh, we think the problem was Herbert Hoover didn't run big enough budget deficits, we can't take a time machine and go back to 1929 and say, let's try having 10% bigger budget deficit and see what happens, right? We only have the one unfolding because human society is so complicated. You don't get controlled experiments. So that's part of what's going on. And then in the Krugman example, um, going into, so, there was the financial crisis in the fall of 2008. Uh, Obama wins, that election, November that year. He comes in and the economy is clearly falling into a recession and people are saying, hey, this is going to be bad. And so Obama's economic team comes out. It was Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein were the chair and the co-chair of his Council of Economic Advisors, and they had this study that they put out to justify, what we loosely called the Obama stimulus package, right when he first came in. And I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but the spirit of this is correct, where they showed, hey, unemployment right now is whatever it was, 7% and change. If we enact the Obama stimulus package, that had a combination of tax cuts and budget, deficit spending, then the unemployment rate will not go above 8%. And they said, in contrast, if we don't pass this stimulus package, then the unemployment rate might get up to whatever 8.5%, something like that, right? So that's how they were warning. So
Yeah.
they went ahead and passed it. In reality, the unemployment rate went above 9%. Okay, so the unemployment rate was worse than what they were warning people. If we do nothing, it might get this bad, right? So that was the sense in which I was saying, Andrew, at the time, prima facie, those of us who were saying, no, this is not a good plan, what more would have to happen for history to vindicate us than that things got worse with their medicine than what they said to the patient will happen if you don't, follow our advice. Whereas you're right, Krugman and those guys, they were still running victory laps, and they said, wow, the economy was in worse shape than we realized. It's a good thing we passed that tepid Obama stimulus package. Imagine if we had done nothing, unemployment would have been 12%, right? So that was my point, that you can't just look at the data, because the way you interpret it, basically what happens is you need to know what's the counterfactual. You need to know, all you really can see is these were the policies the government and the Fed did. This was the outcome. But in order to assess were those good policies or bad policies, you kind of need to know what would the outcome have been if they had done something different. And so to answer that, you obviously need theory. You can't just say, no, I'm just going to go by the facts, because you have to look at an alternate universe that didn't happen. So how would you know? Right. So that's the sense in which, economists in the Austrian tradition stress the fact that you need to have this antecedent theory that you build up logically before you can even go out and interpret the data.
And that's where we get into epistemology and a posteriori and a priori, if I'm saying it right.
No, you are.
For a long time, I called it a priori because I hadn't heard anybody say it, and I'm reading this stuff, and I don't know Latin, right? But
I used to call him Ludwig von Mises until I heard someone say, no, Mises. And I was like, oh,
okay. Right. Yeah. And so, man, like probably the most famous debate of the year, possibly the decade, Dave Smith and Douglas Murray, right? And Douglas Murray is like, when was the last time you were in Israel? And like, it's a zinger that Dave Smith has never been there, so he doesn't know anything.
You've never been. You've never been. Yeah, sorry. No, I just had to do my Douglas Murray. Go ahead.
You haven't been, right? No, I mean it's like, but that's the kind of stuff that I get. Well, I get it on both sides because I don't have a PhD, so I get well, you don't have any experience, or well, you don't have a degree, so whatever. I guess I don't get to think at all. But yeah, it's like empiricism on steroids. It's not enough that you've read about it, that you've read 100 books like Daryl Cooper. That's not enough. You have to actually go there. And is this new hyper empiricism? Is that a thing? Am I making this up?
I mean, it's been a long-standing critique lobbed against the Austrians, in particular against call them the Misesians, meaning like that, the branch of self-described Austrian economists who really point to Ludwig von Mises, because there's different strands, right? Some are bigger fans of Hayek, who, by the way, won the Nobel Prize in '74 for his work primarily on business cycle theory, for people, for your listeners to understand. So yes, Andrew, to answer your question, that Mises and his work stressed the a priori nature of economic theory, going back to what you said a few minutes ago, and the idea that pure economic law, you deduce it thinking through logically. The analogy I use sometimes for people who just think that sounds crazy, or some people say, like, that sounds like medieval scholastics or something. Aren't we supposed to be scientific? And the analogy I would use is say, look, if you want to go build bridges or something, you still learn basic geometry and trigonometry and things like that. And when someone teaches you the Pythagorean theorem, the way it's a proof, you learn the axioms, and then you go through the deduction process, and it is a proof. It's not that you go measure 1,000 right triangles and show that, oh, look, at 99.9% of the time, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Like that, if that's what you thought geometry was, you'd be wrong. So
absolutely.
So there's more involved in building a bridge than just knowing pure math, obviously. But the point is that's a component of it. So by analogy, Mises was saying, like, when you think through the pure logic of economic law, it is that deductive. You start from certain premises and think through them to their logical conclusion, and you don't need to go test it, because that would be misunderstanding the point. But then, yeah, you use that basic foundation to go and evaluate history in an empirical matter. So Mises helped set up a business cycle research institute. Okay, that Hayek was, I think, the first director of, right? So it wasn't that Mises was against looking at like commodity prices to try to come up with some idea of, are we in an upswing of the business cycle? You know, I mean, he wasn't afraid of numbers. It was just he thought people were confused and was just trying to clarify, like, this is what we're doing in economics. And so, you know, the stuff, the Murray Smith debate, yeah, I mean, I think partly there he was just being putting on a smoke and mirror show that, you know, trying to basically say to Joe Rogan, you can't have somebody on your show who's critical of Israel because, you know, that guy's not an expert or something. When, among other things, Douglas Murray has an undergrad degree in English. Okay, so it was a bit weird where clearly he thought he was qualified to tell everybody about what Hamas, not Hamas, he calls it Hamas, was doing. And so, you know, I mean, so again, by his own criteria, it's not obvious why should Joe Rogan be giving a platform to Douglas Murray to talk about the situation. So again, it was I think a bit, he was mostly, you know, arguing just one side or the other based on what was going to be good for his. And the last thing too, I'll just say on that narrow point is, because you brought it up, he was dismissing Daryl Cooper, and he was attributing views to him that Cooper didn't say. Right? He was mixing them up with other people.
Oh yeah.
And then when Rogan said, "Well, have you listened to any? Have you consumed any of his work?" He said, "I don't have to." So it's kind of like he's saying, you know, you're not allowed to comment on things that you haven't personally experienced, and he's willing to call somebody, you know, someone flirting with neo-Nazism, even though he admitted, oh yeah, I actually haven't listened to the guy. So again, a lot of that I think is what it was. But to answer your question, for ever since Mises laid out that position, that's been a way that like more mainstream economists at MIT and Harvard or whatever, to the extent they even know about the Austrians, would dismiss them and say, oh yeah, these guys are like philosophers. But for all the reasons you said earlier, Andrew, we talked about, I think that no, it just shows they're philosophically grounded and realize that, yeah, there's different components, and the framework you're going to deploy to understand the world in economics, at least, is something you deduce logically, and then that allows you to sift through the facts.
And you might help me to put an author to this quote that's in my head, is that good theory explains reality as it is. If it doesn't explain reality, it's not a good theory.
That sounds familiar, but yeah, I don't know who said that.
I can't remember. It might be Mises, honestly, but I can't promise. The idea there is that um, well, that phrase we hear where, oh, that sounds good in theory, or
Right.
that might work in theory but not in real life. Well, if it doesn't work in real life, then it doesn't work in theory. It's not a good theory, because a good economic theory explains reality as it is.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. And again, I understand why people have a knee jerk, you know, reaction, and would be very skeptical if someone comes along, particularly, you know, there've been a lot of economists saying a lot of stuff, and be dubious about it. But ultimately, again, that if you're trying to understand, like, oh, like, you know, like some socialist comes along and proposes a bunch of reforms or something, the only way you could possibly grapple with that is to engage in debates over what you could call economic theory, or theories of how the economy works. Because again, if someone's saying, let's do things differently from how they've been done, you can't just look at history to say whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. Because if they're saying, let's change what we're doing, you need to kind of look into the future and wonder, okay, if we change what we're doing, then how will outcomes differ? And to know that, you know, you have to have some kind of theory of cause and effect. So in some
Right.
cases, it's so obvious. You know, someone says, "Hey, let's shoot somebody in the head because we think that will help cure their headaches." You know, and you could say, "No, I don't think that's going to work because my theory is that," you know. So in some cases, it's like almost trivial.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the theory is so well established that you can say, "No, this is just common sense." But
Uh,
for things that are less obvious, ultimately everybody's going to be arguing over theory. It's just some people, you know, they're so sure that their theory is right, they're going to say that's not even a theory anymore.
right. So, and that's a question I've always had about some of the other uh, more friendly kind of economists, like Thomas Sowell. Where does he fit? Is he a Chicago guy?
It's a great question. so some of his, especially his later stuff, um, like his books, like Basic Economics, and then I think there was one called, I think it might be called Advanced Economics. It's very Hayekian, right? That in certain parts of
Okay.
it, he gets into stuff about how there's dispersed knowledge, like different, and and one of the functions of the market economy is it coordinates everybody's activities and uses prices. So he doesn't cite Hayek by name and say, "Oh, I'm drawing on this insight from the Austrian school," but there's clearly stuff in his writings that he was influenced by Austrians. But to answer your question, Andrew, yeah, I think if you had to put a label on him, you would say he's more of a Chicago school guy. I don't remember where he might have gone to UCLA. Now that I'm thinking, but yeah, so certainly all the free market community he came out of that, but there are elements of his work that were very Hayekian.
And folks that if my audience might not know, economics is broken down into kind of like clubs, where it. I kind of hate to use this analogy, but it's a little bit like denominations because
Oh yeah,
you're all trying to grasp at the truth, but you have different views of what that is. So you have the Baptists and the Presbyterians,
right.
and so on, and it's a little bit like that in economics.
Yeah, so
You
yeah,
explain
the
that.
more formal label would be schools of thought,
Right.
and you're right. The religious analogy is great because I think you're correct. There are a lot of similarities. I'm a Christian and an economist, and so I move in both school camps, and I understand. And I see these disputes, and also to the extent that some more empirically minded people will say, "Well, this is crazy. Like we shouldn't be like religion. We should just go and look at what the data say." And
Mm-hmm.
but again, but this kind of underscores the fact. Okay, but that is showing that there's something going on here, right? And again, and as I said, look at the example with the Great Depression. It's not simply that it's obvious if you just look at what happened in the 30s to know what caused what, and anybody who disagrees with the consensus must be a liar. That's not, or that the consensus is because of the bankers funding everybody or something. That there you really could have a legitimate disagreement because there's no controlled experiments, and so that's partly why these schools of thought persist. And notice, like, where do you have schools of thought? You have it like in history, in economics, in psychiatry. There was like Freudianism was real big for a while, and then it kind of died away. Whereas in like physics and chemistry, you don't see that nearly to the same extent. It's not that there's different rival schools. The only place you see it in physics is something like string theory, right? Like some people
Mm-hmm.
love string theory and some people say they're a bunch of charlatans. But the reason that persists is because they can't do tests, right? Like in other words, the areas of disagreement are such that our accelerators and things like that right now, particle accelerator, they're not powerful enough to be able to test the theory. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I'm saying, that it's showing that, yeah, where these disputes linger is when you can't just go run in a controlled experiment to settle the matter. And so that's why, like in chemistry, there's not really schools of thought the way there are in economics. And to me, it boils down to the social sciences versus the natural sciences. That when you're studying people, they have free will and they're very unpredictable, and so it's hard to come up with just, oh yeah, here's a theory, and then let's test it 1,000 times, hold everything else equal, and we'll just change the one variable and we'll isolate and figure it out. And you can't do that with people.
Right. Right. Do. Uh, yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know what else I was gonna talk to you about. I'm still new at this, Bob.
Sure.
You've
Do you
done.
want to talk about like the tariffs and things like that? Because I've been
Do you
there's
have
a
new ideas?
yeah. Well, so my quick thing on that, in terms of the dispute among like more purist free market type economists and like the MAGA folks, that I've been trying to act almost like a diplomat between them. That I don't so by itself, a tariff is a tax that Washington is levying on imports. And so as a general principle, if Americans are struggling economically, is Washington imposing more taxes on goods that are trying to get to them? Is that going to help? And I would say no. However, you it depends how they do it, right? Like if you raise tariffs a little bit and then use the revenue that was raised to reduce income taxes, that could make sense. And in fact, I've argued that that does make sense. Like in terms of standard economics, that
That
makes
would be
sense.
better.
Yeah, because for just real quickly, in general, economists think that taxing consumption is less harmful than taxing income. Okay, that if you tax, I mean, all taxes distort things, but
Mm-hmm.
if you tax consumption, that's just like a one-shot disincentive. Whereas income, it's also taxing because you can earn income by saving, and so it's not merely taxing your work effort. Like, oh, however many hours I put in, this is as many apples as I can get at the store, and then a tax like drives a wedge, and so now I don't want to work as much. So that's what a consumption tax does. It deadens the incentive to work, but an income tax not only deadens the incentive to sell your labor for money, but also to save because the interest or the dividends from the saving also get taxed as income, at least the way it's done in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why like taxing income has like a double whammy effect. And so economists say if you want to raise, if the government wants to raise $1 billion in revenue, it would be better to tax consumption rather than tax income. So tariffs are closer to just taxing consumption rather than income tax. So there's that element, and also the privacy thing. If they could move to a system where they got
Mm-hmm.
rid of the IRS and just had tariffs and raised the revenue necessary for the federal activities on that, just have at the ports, then people wouldn't have to send in all their information about all their activities to the IRS. And so for just putting aside the narrow economic issues, but just like privacy and how much does Washington have its tabs on everything you got going on in your life, that would be a huge reason to prefer tariffs over income taxes. So that's some of the things. So that's me making a plea for that. On the other hand, there are a lot of could call protectionists making claims on behalf of tariffs that I think are goofy. Like the idea that, oh no, this will that's a good thing per se. Like it shields us from the rest of the world and we can develop our own internal stuff. That I think the standard economists who scoff at that, they're correct that in general, just levying taxes on goods coming in is not good for U.S. industry.
So, first of all, Bob, I got to tell you what, in Oklahoma, the Republican Party, uh, I don't think that you would sign off 100% on our state platform,
Mm-hmm.
but we have in our state, you can look it up online. We call for abolishing the IRS,
Mm-hmm.
the income tax, and the Federal Reserve. So, I mean, what else do you want? What do you want from us?
That would be great. No, that's great stuff. And also on that last point, the Federal Reserve, that's a point too that I've been making to the MAGA fans is
Right.
to show them that you're right. So this is the problem. I think the fans of Trump who are embracing tariffs and think that like free trade is what's caused like the erosion of the manufacturing base, stuff like that. I think they're right that something is really screwed up with the U.S. economy, and that the economists who have been just pushing these deals and policies and say, no, everything's great, don't worry about it, that those economists are deluded. However, um, I think to say, oh, the solution is tariffs, or that's one key component, that they're missing the mark and they're misdiagnosing what's happening. And on the flip side, yeah, the free trade economists who are like, no, this is great. The big trade deficits are just a sign of how awesome our stock market is, and and foreigners want to invest in the U.S. and so that's why that I think they're missing the point that something's screwy. And so my favorite statistic now that I stumbled across is if you look at the annual figures, the from 1946 to 1971, there was only 1 year where the U.S. had a trade deficit, and that year it was like 0.2% of GDP. So it was basically balanced trade. And then from 71 to the present, there were only 2 years where the U.S. had a trade surplus. So
And so,
something big happened in 71, and that's when Nixon closed the gold window.
oh man, I knew that. I knew that. You could have asked me.
Oh,
I
sorry.
could have told you that.
So
No, but that's the thing. That like there's half a dozen things, and I say this. And by the way, I gotta say this. It's not that I'm not MAGA. You can't. It's just that Trump is still a mortal man, and he does get a few things wrong, and this is one of them. That's unfortunate, but he talks about the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, and that we had tariffs, but we had more than just tariffs. We didn't have an income tax. We didn't have a regulatory burden. Uh, we we didn't like the regulatory burden. Just think about that. I mean, you can't cut hair without a stinking license,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of we live in a totally different world. If you want to take us back to the golden age, uh, like get rid of the income tax, get rid of the central bank. We didn't have a central bank back then. Huh? Put us back on gold, right?
Right, right. Yep, I agree with everything you just said there, and right. But one way of seeing it is, Trump is right that back then, the U.S. the federal government primarily they had like excise taxes on alcohol and stuff too. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, part of the issue is they spent so little, right? Like federal spending as a share of GDP was so low back then that they could afford to raise the revenue primarily from tariffs. And so it wasn't that taxing imports per se is the key to prosperity. It was that limiting Washington's spending to a low enough level that tariffs could fund it all. That was the key. In addition to the other things you're mentioning. So yes, if they could go back to just funding it with tariffs, because part of the issue is there's a self-correcting thing where if the tariff rate gets too high, people can just shift to the domestic. I mean, so tariffs. Put it this way: you could not raise the amount of revenue that the IRS takes in right now from just tariffs, because if they put the rates that high, people would just buy domestically. So Washington wouldn't get that money anymore. So that's partly why another reason that relying on tariffs is great. So my only concern with what they're doing is we might get the worst of both worlds if they jack up tariffs and say, "Oh, we'll lower income taxes, don't worry," but then they realize, "Oh, we can't because we still want to spend this much." Then we would have tariffs plus income taxes, which would be a double whammy.
Yeah. Well, and so I listen to your show. I listen to Tom Woods, Dave Smith, and everything, all the greats. Uh, but I kind of I don't know. I guess I do my own thinking through this stuff, and I haven't heard anybody say it, and and I'm not sure that it's necessarily all the way right, but it's got to be approaching right or the right way to think about it. The Laffer curve
Mm-hmm.
does the Laffer curve not apply in a sense? I can see how it breaks down, but the Laffer curve would apply to tariffs on some level.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I was saying. That you just hit the nail on the head. That right. If and it would, I think it would kick in sooner than it would
Sooner.
on an income tax, right? Because you have better like with an income tax. If Washington D.C. just says, "Oh, we're going to tax 60% of your income," or something, at some point, if they jack it up too high, people don't work as much, but you need an income.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if they say, "Oh, foreign imports, we're going to put a 60% surtax or surcharge on them," people do have the option of just buying from a U.S. producer. So
We'll just
that's
go
what I'm saying. That
without it.
yeah, because the exit option's easier on a tariff than income tax. That yeah, the Laffer point would probably happen at a lower rate.
Okay, so it's not that it's approaching right; it's more than right. No, that's not. Anyway, okay. I don't know, Bob. You're that's a lot for people to take in. Um, you know, I, like I said, I've followed you for a long time. I didn't just like uh, Google you right before I sat down or anything. Uh, but I didn't know. I have a stack of your books. Um, I didn't know that you had authored 30.
I didn't know that either. Is that the number?
That's what I mean. Chat GPT is
Okay.
wrong sometimes.
No, I'm
Uh,
not. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying I haven't counted them up.
uh,
It's a
yeah,
big number. I don't know if it's 30. If ChatGPT says it is, then that might be the number.
it might be close. I don't know, authored or co-authored, but just particularly, and I hadn't really mentioned this, but uh, if I have you another few minutes, I think that a lot of folks in my audience would be very interested in your primal prescription book. I pulled that one off the shelf.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, um, I don't know. You might give that one a pitch. And I think that would be a great book for people to read something to you as a primer a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, happy to explain that, the elevator pitch. So I co-authored that with Doug McGuff, who is a doctor who works in the emergency room, and it was the reason for the primal. It was Mark Sisson, the primal diet guy is the one that um, kind of recruited us to write that book. And
Oh,
so
okay.
what we're trying to do there is explain like what went wrong with US healthcare. That when that came out, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was just coming in. So we, kind of gave the assessment of that. And we were explaining it, Andrew, it's kind of similar to what I was saying 10 minutes ago about this issue with the tariffs and trade deficits, that when Obamacare was coming in, I noticed a similar thing where a lot of the free market economist types were correctly saying, no, this proposed solution that, President Obama's pushing through with Affordable Care Act is going to be bad for, XYZ reasons. And they were correct. But then they sort of left open the idea that in America's got the best healthcare system in the world. And yeah, if you want, why don't you go to Canada and get on a wait list? And they were making it sound like people who were not getting good quick care or who were concerned about, geez, things are really, if you get a serious condition that could bankrupt you, and that they were just nuts or they're a bunch of communists or something. And you know what I mean? So we were saying the same thing there, that we were trying to show, no, there really is something screwed up with US healthcare, but the problem's not because it's for profit. And so part of what we do in that book in the opening section is just go through historically all the bad policies coming from, state and federal government, that why is it that insurance is so expensive and then it doesn't cover the stuff you need when you need it and that sort of thing. And why is healthcare so expensive going into, like, why did the public, why were they so receptive to Obama's message and embrace that? And so we explained that stuff. And then, yeah, we did go through uh, why the Affordable Care Act was not going to solve the problems, just make it worse, and paint the way, people for demanding that the government just take over, single payer. And then at the end, because it was, a Mark Sisson publication or product from his publishing warehouse, we did explain, that the idea of like, here's how you can take charge of your own health, and that sort of thing too. So that's all contained in that book.
Yeah, it was that part was good too. I I appreciated I appreciated that where you kind of take control.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's especially if you're admitted to the hospital, you're the consumer,
Yeah.
but you have lost all. You're not in control anymore. As a consumer, you're no longer in control, and
Well, yeah, I mean that's kind of what and just for people to get, so it's kind of blending the theory and the practice, to go back to our earlier thing, that I was the economic theory guy,
mm,
and then Doug McGuff was the the ER doctor. So he's working in the he was in the trenches, and so we could both, it was a good blend there, that of a neither of us could have written that book ourselves, if you get what I'm saying.
yeah,
And you're right, Andrew, that it's one way we put it is that to understand like why is stuff so expensive now, and why is the service so poor, and why are you treated like a cog in the machine, is because you're the patient, but you're actually not the customer, in the sense the hospital, they're getting paid by either the insurance companies or the government. They don't need to make you happy, because you're not actually the one paying them. You know what I mean? And so that was the element. And the analogy I use is, imagine when you went to go buy a new car, if you had to go in and they would show you the car, and you'd pick it, and then after you were on the hook for buying it, they would tell you how much it was. Can you imagine how screwed up the car market would be? And yet that's how healthcare works, that you can go in, like there was experiments where some lady was pregnant, and she was like a newscaster, for a radio station, and she called like to 10 hospitals around her just to say, yeah, for a regular delivery, no complications or everything, how much would it be if I went with you and did it there? And something like only one of them would give her a number, like a quote. The other 9 would refuse to even give her a dollar figure. And the one that gave her the quote said, now, this isn't actually a contract. Like, in practice, we might end up charging you twice this. So again, just showing, like, when people wonder why is healthcare so expensive, that's not free market capitalism. Call whatever I just described to you what you will, but that's certainly not laissez-faire, market economy going on there.
yeah. It's almost like going back to the beginning is that uh, healthcare is so expensive not because of they're profit driven, but because it's not a free market uh, in
Right,
healthcare.
right, yeah. And so again, there's, it's spelled out in the book, but there's lots of
Yeah.
things involved as to why that is. The FDA, in terms of like why are certain pharmaceuticals so expensive. You have to spend depending on the situation, the major drug companies, they have to spend more than $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. So that's why they only focus on things that we're going to have a wide appeal. If some people who have some rare condition, it's not worth anybody's effort to fund the research into curing that or alleviating it, because again, you got to jump through all these hoops that the FDA puts in place. And then the flip side too, it's when something like Vioxx, for example, is the classic example. If the FDA does approve something that they really shouldn't have, it takes them a long time to admit it, because then that's ex post admitting, oh yeah, all the people that died, that was because of our screw up. So you're
Right.
getting kind of the worst of both worlds, that certain drugs that might help some people are kept off the market out of conservatism, but then certain dangerous things, the FDA is slow to admit its mistake because that looks bad.
It's it's a mess. Um, oh, so yeah, I guess we got like 5 minutes. There's no need to take every last minute. Hit your like where people can find you. This is
Sure.
how you all do it.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I get one place is Twitter, where I post all my stuff. So that I'm at Bob Murphy Econ, if people want to go to Twitter, or X as they call it. But yeah, BobMurphyShow.com is my main podcast. Again, I host the Human Action podcast at the Mises Institute. So that's MISES.org is Mises.org, the Mises Institute. And then if you're interested more in like financial analysis and also issues related to like blockchain technology and insurance, that you would go to Infinio.ai is the website for the company Infinio that I work for.
Gotcha. I'm on X at real Andrew Hayes. That's me. So you can follow me back if you want, Bob.
I will look you up.
All right. Hey, thanks for coming on. It's like I say, it's incredible to have you on, and anytime you want to talk to the people in Oklahoma, yeah, would have you back. So I'm still not good at closing out shows. I don't know how to do it. Close us out, Bob.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for this opportunity to share the perspective of Mises and other economists. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
That's amazing. All right. Thanks, Bob.